The third week of the harvest, before the bell had rung for the men, Keziah Stannard crossed the wet yard at Severnmore with a lantern in her raw hand and found the barn door standing open, a wit that had no business standing. She had latched it herself the night before. She knew the weight of that door, the way the bottom corner dragged in the mud and had to be lifted on its hinge, and no wind in Davonmore pushed it open from outside. Something had pushed it from within. She lifted the lantern. The straw at the threshold was dark, in a long smear that was not rain, and over the clean smell of the hay was iron, warm. A man lay against the far stall, half buried in the straw. One boot, gone, and the other caked to the calf. He had dragged himself. She could see it written in the floor behind him, a wide plowed track toward the one warm animal in the place. His coat had been a soldier's, the red nearly black down one side. His face was turned to the wall, his breath shallow and slow, with a silence between breaths long enough to count. She did not scream. She had buried a father and a brother and the man who was to have married her, all in 2 bad winters, and the screening had been used up in her long ago. She set the lantern down where it would not fall, into the straw, knelt, and put 2 fingers to his throat the way she would to a downed ewe, and felt the pulse quick, and thin, and frightened of its own quickness. That is where this begins. Not with a ball, not with a carriage, but with a kneeling woman in a borrowed apron and a bleeding stranger in a barn she did not own, on land she did not own, in a county that had decided years before what she was worth. Stay a while. The deciding was not finished. She did what the land had taught her. She tore her underskirt into a long, clean band, packed the wound where the cloth was darkest, and bound it hard, talking the whole time in the low, even voice she used on a frightened beast, words that meant only that he was not alone. He stirred. His hand came up off the straw and closed around her wrist with a grip that had no strength but a great deal of will, and his eyes opened, gray as slate under rain, and fixed on her face as though it were a thing he had been trying to reach. He said one word. It was not a name, and it was not a plea. Stay then. The grip loosened, the eyes closed, and the slow breathing went on. She stayed until Loveday Goodge came down from the dairy to ask why the cows had not been let out, then sent her running for the surgeon at Davonmore, and stayed kneeling, her hand over the wound, the lantern guttering, the morning coming up gray and ordinary, as though the world had not changed in the night. She did not yet know whose man this was, did not know the coat belonged to the only person in the county, with the power to put her off the land. She knew only the pulse under her fingers, and that it was hers to keep going. Keziah was 26 that autumn, and the county had long since decided what to make of her. Her father had farmed Severnmore under the old earl, 60 acres of decent mixed ground, and farmed it well. And when he died of a fever in the cold spring, the lease had not been his to leave. It had been a yearly thing, a handshake and a rent day, the kind of arrangement the gentry kept until they did not. Her brother might have carried it, but he was buried beside their father. So Keziah, who could plow a straight furrow and judge a beast's weight by her eye and keep a farm's books in a hand finer than the curate's, became what the parish called a field woman, a polite way of saying she worked for her bread on ground that had been her family's. To the village she was the Stannard girl who would not marry and would not weep and would not be pitied, and the village, not knowing what to do with a woman who refused all 3, decided between the church porch and the well that she was proud, a hard creature with dirt under her nails. Mrs. Pinnock, the land agent's wife, said it plainest, leaning to a neighbor at the Lychgate one Sunday in a whisper pitched to Carrie. That one thinks herself above honest service and her with nothing. Pride, in a girl with nothing, is the worst kind of waste. Keziah heard it. She heard most things working at the edges of other people's lives, and let it pass over her as she let the rain pass, because there was no profit in answering, and a great deal of cost. She had her wages, £11 a year, and her keep, and the small good things she allowed herself, the smell of the dairy at dawn, the weight of a warm egg, The square of her mother's worked linen kept folded in her box and never used. She did not want pity. She wanted the work, and the work she had. The man in the barn did not die. The surgeon came, a sober man named Threlkeld, who said little, and frowned at the wound, and frowned harder when he had cut the coat away, because it was old and new at once. A bayonet's mark badly healed and torn open afresh by hard riding and a fall. He had come a long way, hurt this man. He had come from a war. They could not move him far, and so they made him a bed in the loft chamber, over the dairy, warm from the beasts below. And Keziah, because she had found him and no one else would give up an hour of harvest to nurse a stranger, was set to keep him. She did it thoroughly and without complaint, changing the linen morning and night, sitting the fevered nights with her mending in her lap. 3 nights in, he began to talk in his sleep, and what he said were not a common soldier's. He gave orders, in a low, even voice, to men who were not there. But once he said very clearly, in the dead of night, "Hold the line, do not let them turn the left," and then wept without waking. 2 slow tears off the side of a hard face, and Keziah, who had not wept in 2 years, sat very still and did not look away, because it ought to be witnessed, even if it could not be helped. On the 5th day, the fever broke. She came up the loft ladder at dawn with the broth, and found him awake, propped against the wall, his gray eyes clear and following her, and she stopped on the top rung with the bowl in her hand. "You are the woman from the barn," he said. His voice was rough with disuse, but level, accustomed to being obeyed without being raised. "You bound the wound. I felt your hands. You will spill the broth if you talk," she said. And I carried it up a ladder. Something moved at the corner of his hard mouth that was not quite a smile. He let her feed him, watching her with an attention that should have discomfited her, and somehow did not, because there was nothing idle in it, the look of a man taking the measure of something unexpected. When the bowl was empty, he asked, "What is the name of this place?" "Severmore," she said. "The home farm of the Hollybourne estate. You are over the dairy. The barn where you crawled in is below the rise. You were near dead in it." He was quiet. "And the man who holds Hollybourne, the young Earl of Hartcombe," she said. "He went for a soldier 4 years past and has not been seen since, and the dowager keeps the house in his name, the agent keeps the rents, and the rest of us keep working." She set the bowl aside. "He is owed a fortune in our sweat, and has never seen a furrow of it. Lie back." The man lay back and looked at the rafters a long while, the line of his jaw setting hard as carved stone, the eyes going somewhere she could not follow. He did not tell her, that morning, or for many after, that she had just described him to his own face. When she asked his name, he said only, "Call me Rayton. It will do." And it would do, for it was the truth. Only not the whole, and the whole would have changed her face, and he found to his surprise that he did not yet wish it to change. What she did not yet know was that he had come home in secret on purpose. In a hospital tent across the water, he had heard his estate was managed in a way that did not sit right, his steward's letters grown evasive and the accounts thin, and he had ridden home unannounced and out of uniform to see what was done at Hollybourne when its master was thought gone for good. He had nearly died of the seeing in a ditch a mile from his own door, and been carried half dead into the one place where the truth of his land was kept, not in a ledger, but in a pair of raw, competent hands. So he stayed Rayton, and watched, and mended, and learned the farm through her. She did not coddle him, which he found he could not have borne. As his strength came back, she set him small, useful tasks, having no patience for idleness. She brought him the rough book of the home farm's yield and asked him, since he claimed a head for figures, to check her sums, and he did, and they were exact. And she said, "Of course they are exact. Do you think I keep them for amusement?" And he laughed. A short, rusty sound, the first and longer than he remembered. He learned, sitting in the loft with her book in his lap, that the home farm paid the agent a rent half again, what the land could bear. the difference made up by the families going hungry through the lean months, and that this had been so for 3 years, since Pinnock and the Dowager took the management between them. He said nothing of what it meant. He asked her instead about the families, and she told him, because she had the whole of Davonmore in her head, who was behind on what and why, whose roof leaked, which old man could no longer swing a scythe and worked anyway, because to stop was to starve. "You carry the whole of them," he said one evening low. The light was failing. She was darning by the last of it. "Why? None of it is yours to carry." She did not look up from the sock. "Someone has to know it," she said. "If no one knows it, it is as though they did not suffer at all. I cannot mend their roofs. I can know." He looked at her in the failing light, at the bent head and the raw hands moving sure in the near dark, and something in him that had been frozen hard since a field across the water and the men he had not been able to hold there came loose all at once with no sound. He did not name it, and would not for a long while. He marked the hour all the same. The Dowager came to know there was a stranger at Severnmore, because she came to know everything, and what she did not approve of, she removed. Lady Maud Rayton had kept Hollybourne in iron order for 4 years, and had her own reasons for wishing it kept so. And a nameless wounded soldier nursed by the proud Stannard girl was a loose thread in a weave she had taken great care over. She came down in her black carriage one bright, cold morning and did not get out. She had Keziah brought to the carriage window, its own kind of message, and looked the younger woman over with the still attention of a woman pricing a heifer she has no intention of buying. "They tell me you have taken in a vagrant," the Dowager said. Her voice was beautiful, low and dry and perfectly polished, the voice of a woman who had never once had to raise it. "A discharged soldier, wounded and penniless. You will turn him out by Sunday. We do not keep beggars on Hollybourne ground. And I will not have the home farm made a hospital by a girl who forgets her place so far as to play Lady Bountiful with charity she cannot afford. You have nothing, Stannard. Pride in a girl with nothing is the worst kind of waste." Sunday. The window went up. The carriage turned in the yard and went, and Keziah stood in the cold with the words sitting in her like a stone, because she had heard them before the very same. From Mrs. Potter Pinnock at the Lich Gate, and understood for the first time where Mrs. Pinnock had got them. She did not turn him out. She told the soldier of it that evening, plainly, because she would not have him learn it sideways, and watched his face when she said the Dowager's name, and it did the carved stone thing again. Then he said in his level voice, "You will not turn me out." It was not a question, she said. Sunday or no Sunday, I do not put a healing man into a ditch to please a woman in a carriage. It may cost me the place. She can have me off this land with a word, and the word would not cost her a thought. "And you keep me anyway," he said, looking at her in the way she had not learned to bear, the close gray attention with the whole man behind it. "I keep you anyway," she said, and took up the broth, and that was that she could not have guessed what it had cost him to lie still in that loft and hear his own aunt threaten the one good thing on his land. He had nearly risen and named himself and ended the pretense in a single sentence, and stopped only because the cold, clear part of his mind that had kept men alive on a battlefield understood that to reveal himself now was to lose the truth he had come home to find. The proof was being kept, all unknowing, in a field woman's tally book. So he stayed Rayton. Then Pinnock made his move, and it was not against the soldier. It was against the families. The quit notices went out on a Friday, hand-delivered by the agent himself with 2 men behind him, folded papers under the Dowager's own seal, informing 4 families of the home farm that their tenancies were determined at Lady Day, that they were to quit cottage and ground by spring. The whole home farm thrown into one holding, and let to a single grand tenant at a single grand rent. Old Cuthbert Maycott had a notice. The Goodges had a notice. The widow at the bottom cottage, who had buried 2 sons in the war, had a notice. The papers were perfect, the seal right, the hand the steward's. Nothing in them a magistrate would look at twice, and every family that held one knew it, and it went through Davonmore like frost. Keziah read every one of them, because the families brought them to her, because she was the one who could read the lawyer's hand and tell them what it meant. and what it meant was ruin. She sat at her small table with the 4 papers spread and the candle low, and the third time she read them she went very still, because the back rents the families were said to owe did not match the rents she had set down in her own book year on year, the rents they had actually paid, sweated, gone hungry to pay. The papers said they owed what they had already given. Somewhere between the rent day and the steward's ledger, the money had been written down as never paid. The difference gone into a pocket, and now the false debt was being used to turn them off the land it had bled them to keep. She understood it whole, in one cold rush the way she understood weather. It was not a clearing for improvement. It was a theft 3 years old, and the clearing was its burying. Turn the families off, scatter them to the parishes, and there would be no one left who remembered what they had paid, no witness to set a true figure beside the false. Her book was the only record on earth of what was true. She told the soldier. She brought the 4 papers and her own book up the loft ladder by candle, spread them on the foot of his bed, and showed him the 2 columns that could not both be true. His face this time did not go to carved stone. It went white, and then to something far more dangerous, a stillness with a furnace behind it, and he said very quietly, "Who is the steward who signed these, Pinnock?" she said. "And the seal is the dowager's. They are in it together, and they will win. Because who am I? I can stand in the manor court and say these figures are false, and they will say a field woman's scratchings are no evidence against the steward's ledger and the lady's seal, and they will be believed, because that is how it has always gone. I show you because someone ought to know. You taught me that." He took her hand. He had never done so. It closed over her raw, ink-stained fingers, the way hers had closed over the wound the first morning, hard and full of a will greater than its strength, and he said, "Keziah." It was the first time he had used her given name, and he used it as a man lays down a stake. He does not mean to take up again. They will not win. You have my word. Do you understand me? She did not understand him. She thought it the kindness of a penniless soldier, with nothing to give but words, and took them for what she believed they were worth. Nothing in a manor court, and a great deal in the loft, at midnight, and let her hand stay in his a moment before she took it back. She did not know that she had just handed the Earl the one weapon his enemies had not thought to take from him. It went wrong before it went right. The dowager, who missed nothing, learned that the Stannard girl had been carrying the quit notices and gathering the families to make trouble at the manor court, and moved to crush it before it could find a voice. She did it in public, at the harvest home gathering, in the great barn at Hollybourne, where by old custom all the estate came together once a year to be fed by their lord, or in his absence his lady. Keziah had not meant to go. She went because the families asked her to, because they were frightened, and she was the one who was not, and she stood at the edge of the lamplit barn, in her one good gown of plain gray wool, gone thin at the elbows, among the tenants and laborers. The dowager sat in a great chair at the head of the long table, in black silk and diamonds, and beside her a young woman in rose satin whom Keziah did not know. The young woman was Miss Effie Wexford, an heiress out of the next county, brought to Hollybourne by the dowager, for reasons she kept to herself, lovely and rich and bored, and she looked at the gray-gowned field woman with the mild cruelty of the comfortable, and said, not quietly, "Is that the creature who keeps the soldier? She is browner than the laborers. One can hardly tell her from the men." The dowager smiled. She had been waiting for an opening, and the girl had handed it to her. She raised her beautiful low voice just enough to carry the length of the barn, and the talk fell away because when she spoke the estate listened. "That," she said, "is the Stannard girl who fancies herself the conscience of Davonmore. Her father was my late husband's tenant, and could not even keep a yearly lease, and the daughter works the ground now for wages, and yet she goes about the parish stirring up the families against their betters with tales she has invented in her ledger. Pride in a girl with nothing is the worst kind of waste. I say it before you all so that none mistake her muttering for truth. She is a hired hand with ink on her fingers and grievance in her heart, and she has no standing here at all." It was the third time. Keziah knew the words for the third voicing of the same blow, first at the lich gate from the wife, then at the carriage window from the lady herself, and now here, in the full lamplight, before the whole estate, public, and meant to end her. The barn was silent. The families would not meet her eyes, afraid, and she stood alone in the gray gown with the false debt that would scatter them folded against her heart. And for one moment, the thing the village had decided seemed to close over her head like cold water. Nothing left to her now, not even the work. She did not weep. She set down the cup she had not drunk from, turned, and walked out of the lamplit barn into the dark of the yard, alone with the whole estate watching her go, and not one of them moving. And behind her the talk rose again like water closing over a stone. She walked back to Severnmore in the dark, with the cold coming up out of the ground through her worn shoes, and did not go up to the loft, because she could not have borne the soldier's gray eyes in that hour, the eyes of one more person who would learn she was nothing and turn away. She sat instead at her own table in the dark, with the false papers and her true book before her, and understood that she had lost. The book was nothing. Her word was nothing. They would clear the families at Lady Day, the widow to the workhouse, old Maycott to a ditch as the soldier nearly had. And there was nothing she could do because the woman in the diamonds had said so before them all. And the saying made it true. She put her head down on her arms over the book and did not weep. But she came nearer to it that night than she had in 2 years. She did not see him cross the yard. She did not know the dowager's word had carried as far as the loft, that a man heeling in the warm dark had heard it through the boards, the heiress's cruelty and the aunt's polished knife, and the silence of the families and the one true person on his land walking out into the cold. When no light kindled in her window, he had come down the ladder one careful rung at a time, his hand pressed to his half-healed side, crossed the yard, and stood now in her doorway with the night behind him. "Keziah!" He said it low, from the doorway. She lifted her head from her arms. She did not light the candle. "You should not be on your feet," she said, her voice steadier than she had any right to. "Go back up. There is nothing here for you to see." "I heard her," he said. He came in and stood over the table, over the spread papers he could not read in the dark and did not need to. "I heard every word she said of you in that barn. I heard you walk out alone. And I have been a coward in a warm bed 3 days too long." He drew a slow breath against the wound. "There's a thing I have not told you, and the not telling has become a lie, and I am done. Light the candle." She lit it, because there was that in his voice which did not admit of refusal, and the small flame came up between them, and she looked at the man she had pulled out of the straw, whose figures were exact, who had taken her hand at midnight and given his word, and saw that he was not looking at her as a soldier looks at the woman who nursed him, but as a man about to lay everything on the table and let it fall how it will. "My name is Alaric Rayton," he said. "I am the Earl of Hartcombe, that barn where you found me. This loft, the home farm, all of it mine. The false ledger is kept in my name, and the woman who called you nothing in my barn tonight is my father's sister, and she has been robbing my tenants and clearing my land behind my back for 3 years, while I bled in a foreign field believing I had left it in honest hands. I came home in secret to see the truth of it. And what I could not find in any ledger I have found, instead in your book, in your hands." His level voice was not quite level now. "I should have told you the first morning. I did not, because I was learning who you were and did not want the knowing of what I am to change the way you looked at me. That was a coward's reason, and I am sorry for it." She did not speak. The whole of it turned over in her at once, the man she had fed and scolded and sat with, in the fever now standing in her doorway, with a coronet behind his name. And behind the first rush of shame came something colder. He owned the land she worked. He had watched her keep the books of his own home farm and said nothing. He had let her show him the theft and name herself nothing, knowing all the while who he was, and who she was and the gulf between them. "Then you have known all along," she said very low, "that you could end it with a word. And you let me carry it. You let me walk out of that barn alone." "Yes," he said. He did not flinch from it. "And I will carry the cost of that walk all my life. I let you carry it for one reason, and you of all people will understand it, because you taught it to me in this room. The truth had to be kept until it could be proved, or it would be buried with the families. I needed your book to be yours, kept in your hand, year on year, with no lord's thumb upon it, or they would have said I made it. Tomorrow there is a manor court. By custom the steward renders the home farm accounts before the assembled tenants, and the lord, if present, presides. Pinnock thinks I am 4 years and a sea away. He will render his false account under the dowager's seal and confirm the clearing." He laid his hand flat on her book. "I mean to be present. When he has finished his lie, I will ask one field woman to read the truth from her own book, before them all, in the same barn where my aunt called her nothing." The candle stood between them. Keziah looked at the man across her own small table, and the gulf was still there and would always be there, and she found that she did not care about it at all. She cared about the widow and old Maycott, and the true figures in her own hand, and the one chance to set them before people who must hear. "I will read," she said. The manor court of Hollybourne met the next forenoon in the great barn. One long table set across the head of it with the steward's box of papers and the dowager's great chair beside. And the whole estate came, because word had gone round in the night that the Stannard girl meant to make her trouble after all. And they had watched her broken the evening before and came to see the breaking finished. Pinnock stood at the head table in his good black coat, the ledger open and the seal at his hand. The dowager sat in gray silk, composed, certain. A woman whose script had worked in every barn and drawing-room of her life, and had no reason to fail. Now Miss Vexford sat at her side. The family stood close-packed and silent at the lower end, and Keziah stood among them in the thin gray gown, with her own book held against her. She did not look for the soldier, because she did not know whether he would come, and had decided in the night that it did not matter. She would read whether he came or not. That was the difference the past weeks had made in her. Pinnock began. He had a dry, careful voice, and a manner of righteous patience, and he rendered the home farm accounts exactly as he had for 3 years, the rents owed and the rents short, the arrears mounting, the families fallen so far behind that the estate with great reluctance had been compelled to determine their tenancies for the good husbandry of the whole. The family's faces went gray at the lie, and he closed the ledger and laid his hand upon the seal, and said the accounts were rendered and confirmed under the authority of the house, and was there any who would dispute them? The form of the question was old. No one was meant to answer it. "I dispute them," said Keziah Stannard, and stepped out from among the families into the open floor of the barn with her book in her 2 hands. The dowager did not so much as turn her head. "The girl has no standing," she said to the heir in her beautiful low voice. "She is a hired laborer. Put her out." "She has my leave to speak," said a voice from the great doorway. "And this is my barn." Every head in the place turned. He stood in the doorway with the morning light behind him, not in the soldier's torn red coat now, but in a gentleman's dark blue, plain and well-cut, pale still and not quite straight. One hand at his side. But he stood, and there was that in the way he stood, the carved stone set of the jaw. The slate-gray eyes going slowly down the barn to rest upon his aunt, that told every soul present, before a name was spoken, exactly who he was. The dowager's face did not move. Her hand on the arm of the great chair closed slowly until the knuckles whitened, and in that one small motion, her certainty cracked, because she knew the instant she saw his eyes that her 4 safe years across the sea were over. He came down the length of the barn slowly, because he could not come quickly, and the slowness was its own authority, and he stopped beside the field woman at the center of the floor, not before her, and not above her, beside her, and turned to the head table where his aunt sat and his steward stood, one hand still on the false seal. "For those who do not know me," he said, his level voice carrying to every corner. "I am Alaric Rayton, the Earl of Hartcombe. I have been 4 years at the war, and these last weeks in the loft over my own dairy, where I was carried near dead and nursed back to life by a woman this estate has been taught to call nothing. I have heard the accounts my steward rendered just now, and learned the truth of them these past weeks from the only honest book on this land." Miss Stannard came to dispute the accounts. "She has my leave and my authority, and she will read. You will all hear her to the end." He turned to Keziah. He did not take her hand, though she saw that he wished to, and the not taking of it before them all was its own restraint. He said, only, "Read." She read from her own book, year on year, the rent set and the rent paid. In her clear, even voice that did not shake, the true figures of what each family had given set against Pinnock's figures of what they were said to owe. She read the widow's rents, paid in full every Lady Day for 3 years, written in the ledger as never paid. She read old Maycott's and the Goodges. And as she read, the families began to nod, because they remembered the rent days, the counted coins, the receipts Pinnock had given, and then written down as never given. She let the figures do their own work, because they had always been enough, if only someone would make a room hear them. When she had finished, there was a silence in the barn deeper than the one that had followed the dowager's cruelty the night before, a different silence, the silence of a great many people understanding at once that they have been robbed, and that the woman they had called nothing has just handed them back the truth of their own lives. "The book is invention," said the dowager, her beautiful voice cracked now, a thread of something high and frightened under the polish. "A field woman's scribbling. Where are the receipts?" Words on cheap paper prove nothing against the steward's ledger and the seal of this house. And here the dowager mounted her last defense, and it was a real one, for she had not been careless. Pinnock, over 3 years, had taken back the receipts as he gave them, on one pretext or another, a new system of bookkeeping, a tidying of records, so that the families held no papers of their own to set against his ledger. She had closed that door, and played the card she had kept, that there was no proof but a laborer's book against a steward's ledger. "The receipts were collected back," said old Cuthbert Maycott suddenly from the lower end, his cracked old voice rising where no one had asked it to. "3 winters since, Mr. Pinnock said it was a new way of keeping. He took mine out of my own hand. I thought it strange. I am a stupid old man, and I let him." "As did I," said the widow. "And I," said Goodge. The dowager had closed the door on the receipts. She had not thought to close it on the memory of why they were gone, and the taking back of them, the perfect cover, became the very proof of the design. Because honest bookkeeping does not require a steward to strip every tenant of his copy. The whole barn saw it. The Earl turned to his steward. "The receipts you collected, Pinnock. You will produce them, every one." Now, Pinnock could not produce them. He had burned them. His hand left the seal, and his careful, righteous manner came apart at the seams, before the assembled estate, and he looked for one wild moment to the dowager, and she did not look back. That was her recognition, the cold understanding of a woman who has measured the room and found her script will not work here, and it crossed her composed face for a single breath before she put it away, and sat very straight and was silent. The Earl had it in his power to do a great deal, and he did the calibrated thing and not a grain more. He stripped Pinnock of his stewardship and his cottage on the spot, and gave him until Lady Day, the very day he had set for the families to be gone, and named the false debts void. Every one, the cleared tenancies restored, the rents set from that day at what the land could bear and not a shilling more, the figure taken from Miss Stannard's book, which he named the true account of the home farm. To the dowager he said less, and quietly, that she would remove to the dower house at the year's end, and live on her ample jointure, that he would not make public what she had done, for the honor of his father's name, and not hers, and never again would she set foot on the home farm, or speak the word nothing in his hearing. She rose, inclined her head the precise degree custom required and no further, and went out to her black carriage with her certainty in ruins but her back straight, and the heiress in rose satin went out after her in great confusion, and that was the last the home farm saw of either. It was over more quietly than it had begun. There was no cheering. The families were too newly returned from the edge of ruin for it. They came instead one by one to the woman in the gray gown at the center of the barn, old Maycott first, and took her ink-stained hand in their work-hard ones and said nothing, or only her name. And Keziah, who had not wept in 2 years, felt the long used-up thing rise at last, and let it. 2 slow tears off the side of a face gone hard to keep from breaking, witnessed now by a barn that had learned in one forenoon exactly what she was worth. The Earl stood a little apart and let her have it, because the recognition was hers and not his to share, and did not cross until the last had gone. Then he crossed into the bright cold noon of the emptying barn, stopped before her, and for the first time since the loft took her hand, openly before the few who lingered, and held it, raw and ink-stained, in both of his. "I owe you my life," he said low. "I have owed it since the first morning, and I find I do not wish to pay it back. I wish to spend the whole of mine beside the only honest hands in this county. I am asking you to marry me, Keziah. Not the field woman the dowager named, not the laborer with ink on her fingers. You, the one who kept the truth when keeping it, cost her everything and gave her nothing. Be the Countess of Hartcombe, keep the books, and never call yourself nothing again, least of all in my hearing." She looked down at her hand in his, then at the great barn, his barn, the land she had worked that he had owned, and found, again, that she did not care about the gulf, and this time understood why. He had not crossed it to lift her out of charity. He had crossed it because she had been all along on level ground with him, and the only person, too proud or too blind to see it, had been herself. "You are still pale," she said, "and you stood too long, and you will tear the wound. And if I am to keep your books, I will not have my work undone by your dying of stubbornness in a barn. Sit down, a breath." The smallest unguarded thing at the corner of her mouth, the first in 2 years. "Yes. Sit down, my lord." And yes. And the thing that crossed his hard face then, the brief, astonished warmth of a man who had not expected to be glad of anything again, was treated by both of them, rightly, as a significant event. They were married at the small gray church at Davonmore before the first snow. Quietly, with the home farm families in the pews, old Maycott given the place of honor near the front, and the widow weeping happily into the borrowed gloves Keziah had pressed upon her. There was no diamond at her throat. Pinned at the breast of her gown was the square of her mother's worked linen, kept folded in her box for 6 years, and never used, brought out at last, because the day had come that her mother had wanted for her, and had not lived to see. And it seemed to Keziah that her mother ought to be at the wedding in the only way left to her. The estate came right slowly, the way the land does, season on season, and Keziah kept its books, all of them now, in her clear, even hand, and the rent stood at what the land could bear, and old Maycott kept his cottage to the end of his days and died warm in his own bed with his roof sound over him. More than he had dared hope on the Friday, the false notice came. The new countess was browner than the other ladies of the county still, and her hands stayed work hard. Because she would not give up the dairy at dawn, and the county, which had decided once exactly what she was, learned the long, slow lesson of being wrong, because the seeing of her had been true. On a winter evening, near the first year's end, they sat by the fire in the long room at Hollybourne, the snow coming down soft past the dark windows, and the Earl, who had grown easier in his silences, watched his wife at her book by the candle. The bent head and the sure, raw hands moving in the firelight, exactly as they had in the loft the first night he marked the hour. If you have ever been named nothing by someone too comfortable to look at you properly, keep the memory of this fieldwoman who held the truth in her hands until a room could be made to hear it. The snow went on falling, and Keziah lifted her head, found him looking at her, and did not look away. She set down the pen, Outside, the snow buried the furrows she had plowed and would plow again. Inside, the fire held. The square of her mother's linen lay folded, now on the mantel where she could see it, and the man she had pulled out of the straw on a gray morning sat across from her in the warm and was not going anywhere. And she had a name now that no carriage window could take from her, and the books were true, the family's warm. And a long account of what she was worth had been rendered at last, in full and confirmed. The fire settled. She rose, crossed the small distance the world had spent a year teaching them was no distance at all, and put her work-hard hand over his where it rested. And he turned his under it, and held it. And neither said anything, because there was nothing left to say. And the snow came down over Hollybourne and over Severnmoor and over the barn where it had begun, and covered the land, all of it, the land she had worked and he had owned, and they would now keep together for the rest of their lives.